1948, Black Friday it was called. Every Soviet system went off the air. And when they started coming back again, every single one of them was using new systems and a new cipher, apart from the ones that had been using the one cipher the British and Americans couldn't break. And it wasn't until the late 70s they began to get back to anything like what they were able to do in 1947-48. And I would argue that given how important signals intelligence is, given how much you get, how accurate it is because you know you're getting it from the horse's mouth, that did far more damage than Cambridge Spies did and ever could have done.
Hello. On the 25th of May 1951, two Englishmen drove in a car to Southampton, took a ferry to France before crossing the Iron Curtain and defecting to the Soviet Union. Their names were Guy Burgess and Donald Maclean, and so began the trail of the Cambridge spy ring that would only end in 1990 when the fifth and final traitor, John Cairncross, was exposed. Added to the disaster of Black Friday of 1948, which you just heard about from my guest Michael Smith, today's episode discusses British and American traitors of the intelligence services. What drives them? How are they caught? And should we throw them in jail? Michael's book, The Real Special Relationship, is our non-fiction book club title. Coming up, there's plenty more history, so please do share. And if you can give me a shiny 5-star rating, I'd be very grateful. But until then, I'll hand you over to me and Michael Smith discussing traitors. Michael, great to have you back on. Thanks for joining me.
It's great to be back. I'm very pleased to be here. Thank you for interviewing me.
Well, of course. So we're talking about your book, The Real Special Relationship, and this is our non-fiction, in our non-fiction book club. And last time you were on, Michael, we were talking about various operations during the war and post-war, which really show off the relationship between the British and the American intelligence services. And your book is really excellent at delving into all those different branches within the intelligence services. So NSA, CIA, FBI, MI5, MI6, and GCHQ. But today I wanted to we did touch briefly in our conversation about the other side of the intelligence relationship between the two countries. And that's where things don't go quite as well as they should, because we're dealing with human beings here after all. And we are talking about the vexed subject of traitors, of which there are actually quite a few on both sides.
Yeah, well, there always will be traitors. And, its motivation, it has many factors, money, sex, the honey traps, famously, of course. There have been lots and lots of different reasons, moral reasons, some will say that they're doing it for the good of the cause, some do it just because out of patriotism. They spy for other countries that actually they feel they belong to more than they belong to their own country. So there's a lot of them out there, and there's quite a few in the book, obviously, because although the book is only dealing with the relationship between British and American intelligence, it can have a huge impact on both sides, and I'm sure we'll get to talk about that later.
Yes, well, okay, so you've talked about moral or ideological reasons, so let's crack on with the Cambridge spy ring.
Oh, right, yeah, let's deal with them first, because actually...
Well, also, because we're talking right at around the time some new revelations or alleged revelations. I think there still needs to be a little bit more work thrashed out about this, but about the fourth man, Anthony Blunt. But the Cambridge spy ring, for the benefit of the listeners, we're talking Guy Burgess, Donald Maclean, Harold Kim Philby, Anthony Blunt, and John Cairncross.
Yeah, exactly those. And you put them in their right order as well, yeah. Donald
Well, in
Maclean
order
first.
of them being exposed.
Yes, yeah. In order of
Oh,
them being
good. Well,
exposed, because Kim Philby technically was the first, but in terms of recruitment, and he put Burgess and Maclean up for recruitment. Blunt came next, and Cairncross was someone he was looking at. Yeah, yes, it's an interesting story, and interesting. All of them would claim that it was ideological, and of course, they were of their generation in the 30s. There was enormous poverty around. Capitalism appeared to have collapsed. And Stalin's Russia was seen very much as this brave new world. Of course, it wasn't. Behind the scenes, it wasn't anything like that. But that's the way that people were painting it in those days. And context is everything, of course.
so if we deal with them one by one, really, Guy Burgess, he had various roles during the Second World War, but did his spying then stop once the war was over? Burgess was no longer a threat.
No, not at all. In fact, he was at his prime in the immediate post-war era because he was Hector McNeil's secretary and a key aide, and he saw everything that Hector McNeil saw. Hector McNeil was a Labour foreign minister under Ernie Bevin, who was the foreign secretary. And Bevin and McNeil saw everything that the intelligence services were planning to do in Russia. And of course, during that period, you also have the Korean War. So it was a very, very important period in Burgess's life as a Soviet spy. In 1948, the Russia Committee was set up inside the Foreign Office, but to look at ways of trying to roll back the Iron Curtain and to unsettle regimes that had taken over in countries like Czechoslovakia, like the whole of the Eastern Bloc, basically. And what the first country they started with, and this is interesting in terms of the Cambridge Five, because Kim Philby is always, his name always comes up in terms of Albania and Operation Valuable, the attempt to undermine the Enver Hoxha government in Albania. The Russia Committee saw Albania as a tiny player, a good place to start if you're going to take regimes apart in the Eastern Bloc. And all of the minutes of the Russia Committee went across Hector McNeil's desk. So Guy Burgess saw them, which means that the KGB offices in London, Residentura in London, saw them and passed them back to Moscow. And so actually the preparations for that operation, to counter that operation, and readiness of the Albanian authorities, helped by the KGB, who sent people in to help them, was started up not by Kim Philby, but by Guy Burgess, who famously was taking documents, hundreds of documents, out of the Foreign Office and handing them over to his KGB contact. At one point, spinning a whole load of them, he brought in what was effectively a suitcase rather than a briefcase over a toilet floor in Westminster. Public toilet floor, to the horror of his KGB contact. So he was producing lots of material. He was also producing lots of material on the British attitude to the Korean War, British entry into the Korean War, and what we were doing with the Americans. So he was a key player, I would say, in that era. And people try and dismiss him sometimes as if he was a clownish figure. He wasn't a clownish figure at all.
I don't know if you've seen the Alan Bennett play of Burgess abroad in Moscow. It's called A Gentleman Abroad.
Gentleman Abroad. All right. Okay. No, I haven't seen it. No, I'm sorry.
It is interesting because it does play up to that idea of Burgess being this sort of amusing, tragic figure, but there's no real indication of what he got up to, during his clandestine activities in spying for the Soviets. It's very much deals with him very sympathetically.
Yes, well, he is a tragic figure, but he was decent person in many ways, but obviously outrageously gay. Not just homosexual. He was outrageously gay, but he was he was a very tragic figure, and I think that's very true of Burgess. It certainly is. And if you read Andrew Lowney's excellent biography of him, that's what you get.
Yeah, I suppose he felt a bit of a loner within his own society, which I wonder if that was a bit of an additional motivation for him spying.
Yeah, it may well have been, but I mean, he was leading student activities in support of bus strikes at Cambridge. So he did have that belief and ideological feeling and support for the workers. And as someone who came from a working class family, I'm not going to knock him for that.
So you very much appreciate his spying efforts for the Soviets, then, Michael?
I don't appreciate them in the sense that it was treason, but I do think that his role is significant as a KGB agent is significantly underplayed by this portrayal of him as a sad, tragic figure who was a bit of a clown. Some of which I'm sure over the years is down to homophobia anyway.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely an element that you see play out. Another figure, I guess, Philby seems to be a different case because I don't know, he seems a little bit more calculating. Obviously, he would argue he did it for ideological purposes, but is there a difference between him and Burgess? I know the role itself is, he's working for MI6, he's rising up the ranks of MI6. But should we view him differently to Guy Burgess?
In terms of the person, I think...
Yeah.
Yeah, well, he's a much less attractive personality, for me. He's very self. Burgess was never very self. It was, he was a complex character, but he was never very me. Whereas Philby was absolutely obsessed. And he was very good at his job as an intelligence officer, very good in his actual role as an KGB agent in place. He wasn't a double agent, he was an agent in place working for the KGB, the NKVD and then the KGB. He was very driven. And of course, all of those qualities, apart from the unknown business of being a KGB agent, all of those qualities of being driven, very good at his job, determined to get the best intelligence possible. All of those led to him being widely well regarded within MI6. He had a lot of friends, some of whom look, with hindsight, very foolish. I remember one former MI6 officer I interviewed who was a friend of Philby's saying he had no loyalty to anyone. Not to his friends, not to the service, not to his country, not to his wives or girlfriends. He was loyal only to himself and what he wanted out of life. And he obviously did damage, but although he became MI6 head of station in Washington, so key liaison with the CIA at the beginning of Operation Valuable, just as it was starting. He wasn't briefed on any of the detail of it, but he didn't need to be. He was briefed on how they were going to go forward on it because he was having those discussions with the CIA. But when some team is going to land in Albania, that wasn't down to him. By and large, it was almost certainly down, in large extent, to the emigres in Rome, who were providing the guys, the pixies, as they were called, because they were so small and light, guys who were going in to set up a resistance, and they couldn't keep their mouths shut. It's interesting, similar thing with the Bay of Pigs. The emigres, anti-Castro emigres in Miami couldn't keep their mouths shut about what was going on. So Philby knew about what MI6 and CIA were planning to do in the future because he would have been the key man in those discussions, but the detail of the operations on the ground wouldn't have been shared at that stage in any great detail. So he couldn't have given those away. The whole thing was flawed from the start because A, the emigres, and B, absolutely crucially, of course, by Burgess.
Well, there's a third Soviet agent here, Donald Maclean, who is stationed in the British Embassy in Washington. Is that right?
Yeah, he was
When
first
he's
secretary
exposed.
during the back end of the war. He was first secretary in Washington, and he was dealing with things like tube alloys, the atomic weapons program. Not necessarily all the detail, but certainly some of the stuff that was going on. But also other stuff, and particular, of course, Roosevelt's conversations with Churchill about post-war Europe would have been extremely interesting to the Russians and would have helped them in their own planning. They were passing that back to Moscow. He was being controlled by someone in New York, so KGB officer based in New York. He was passing all this stuff back to Moscow, and it was being picked up by the US Army codebreakers and intercept operators, and there was a mistake by the KGB, the NKVD as it was, in which they were using one-time pads, which should be secure if they're used properly, but they used, because of the war, difficulty of getting one-time pads from Moscow to New York, they were using duplicates. And this allowed the US Army codebreakers in, and then they brought the British codebreakers in, and this was what was called the Venona project, originally Bride, but it became Venona. And Philby was briefed on that. And they had this agent called Homer. That was his code name, his NKVD code name, KGB code name. He was called Homer. And on one occasion, in what would have been a security lapse, if you hadn't thought that you were using a one-time pad, the KGB officer controlling him mentioned that Homer had to go to New York because his wife was pregnant and living with her mother in New York, so he would be able to come and meet the agent personally. And by that stage, they'd broken Homer's reports. They'd broken the reports and worked out that he had to be someone high up in the embassy because all of these conversations between Roosevelt and Churchill were going through from him. And they narrowed the search down to a certain number of people it could be. And then there was only one of them whose wife was pregnant and living in New York. And that was Maclean. And Philby was briefed on that. And at the time, Burgess was a second secretary in Washington in the embassy. Maclean was no longer in America. These were historical messages that were being broken. And Maclean was in the Foreign Office. They're working on the US desk. Burgess was sent by Philby back. In fact, he was in disgrace. He'd got drunk and been stopped twice in one day for speeding drunk. He was in disgrace, so he was sent back, and Philby told him, seek Maclean out and tell Maclean to go. He had to go to Moscow. He had to defect. And Philby said to Burgess, don't you go too, because he knew that would have pointed direct to him. But Burgess and Maclean went, and that pointed, as I say, directly to Philby himself. And Philby, well, the Americans realised. MI6 still didn't believe it. MI5 realised. MI6, there were lots of people in the MI6, including, crucially, Stuart Mingus, the then C, who didn't believe it. And how could Philby have been an agent?
Your book, it's about the relationship between the two countries. And the Americans must have been hopping mad. The idea that three senior, as you've just described, three senior officers or diplomats working at the highest levels, they're moles. They've borrowed their way into their own intelligence community. They must have been hopping mad, and it really at the highest levels, and seriously affected this special relationship.
Well, yes, of course, there were people who were hopping mad, but they had their own KGB agents already. He'd done immense damage. They were aware of that, but Philby was a great betrayal because Philby had been part of the whole thing in Ryder Street where the OSS was growing up alongside, counterintelligence side was growing up alongside Section 5 of MI6, which was where Philby worked during the war. He had been their friend, they'd known him, and he'd been in Washington and knowing their secrets at the highest levels. And they now realized that he was a KGB spy. And MI6 seemed not to believe it. And there were problems there, obviously. But equally, he was immediately drummed out of the service, so to speak, and although he wasn't arrested. And there were people in Washington at the highest levels, and in the book, I speak about this same attitude all the way through this relationship, where one side or the other has a traitor or makes a huge mistake, or can't, for example, in the case of Afghanistan and Al-Qaeda, get involved in black sites, where the Americans say, okay, yeah, this is pretty difficult for us, and it's a huge problem, but there are always calming voices on the American side who say, look, we do so much more with the Brits. We can't let this one thing destroy all that. We've got to keep going with them. And obviously we make our anger known or disappointment known at times, but we keep going because everything else we get from them is so important. And it is one of the interesting things about MI6 CIA cooperation that unlike NSA, GCHQ, where it's very tight, where there are hundreds of people from GCHQ working in Fort Meade, the NSA headquarters in Maryland, and there are scores of people, at least, Americans working in GCHQ. I don't know the numbers because it's classified, but there are an awful lot of Americans working at GCHQ. And if you went round the desks and you were talking to them, if you were a high up person, you wouldn't necessarily know, other than from their name tags or their accents when they spoke to you, whether they were American or British. I mean, Americans, GCHQ, actually do wear US Embassy tags, so you can tell them.
Is there a way of treating traitors that's different between the Americans and the Brits? So what I'm getting at here is, it seems that in Britain, it's very much, and this comes across in the treatment of Philby, is, well, he's one of us. He's been to the same school as I have, and the same college at Oxbridge. So, let's not embarrass ourselves. And it's all very upsetting. We don't really want to talk about this. Let's pretend it's not happened. And then the Americans will throw their traitor into jail.
The Americans do throw their traitors into jail. We sometimes don't, and the Americans sometimes don't, to be fair. And Ted Hall, who was on the Manhattan Project, he was spying for the KGB, passing secrets, atomic secrets, to the KGB, and would claim that he was doing that and I did claim that he was doing that for moral reasons, because he didn't want America to have the power to destroy the Soviet Union without the Soviet Union having the power to respond, and therefore putting a brake on it all. And that was his argument. They didn't put him in jail because sometimes putting people on trial risks putting the secrets out there more than has already happened. And that's been a huge problem in this country for dealing with Al-Qaeda people, particularly those who've been tortured by the Americans, because the defense will argue that information should be shared in order to make a clear judgment on their clients, and argue that their client, was wrongly treated. For the Americans, that's a no-no. All that stuff coming out in court, it wouldn't happen in a US court, and they don't want it to happen. And here, it's their secrets, and they don't want them out there, and that's understandable. And that's one of the reasons that you don't see so many of these trials anymore, because the British government's policy is just to pay the Al-Qaeda guy off if he claims that MI5 was involved. MI6 was involved, to stop secrets coming out in court.
Okay, so we've discussed the Cambridge spies. There's Cairncross, who again, he's secretary to is it Lord Hankey, I think, releasing secrets, and also Blunt. So that's a sort of it's 5-0 to Britain on the traitor count if we're talking about that today. But one traitor I'd quite like to discuss on the other side, which is William Weisband, who is an American traitor who did a lot of damage.
Yep. Just one thing I would say on Blunt was, there've been stuff in the papers recently about Blunt, but it's all of a might have, could have sort of side to it, and he was there primarily in MI5 to make sure that if any of the others were picked up, there was someone in MI5 who A, could warn them, and B, muddy the waters. But Cairncross, when he was Hankey's secretary, was also secretary to the Tube Alloys Committee, which was the British started the atomic weapons program. It was carried out in America because America was so big and large, but it was the British who actually did the heavy lifting at the beginning. And Cairncross, as private secretary, was told there was an ICI report on how it would all work and the basics of it. Cairncross was told to pass that report to the Americans, which he did. But of course, he also passed it to the KGB, and the father of the Soviet atomic weapons program actually credited Cairncross with being the man who helped him start the program. And that report was crucial to starting the Soviet atomic weapons program, just as it was crucial to starting the joint British-American.
So arguably the most damaging of the 5.
Of the 5, arguably, yeah. I think of the 5, Philby was it was about damage done to the reputation of MI6. Yes, obviously, when he was in Turkey, for example, he was sending agents into the Soviet Union from Turkey, none of whom ever came back again alive. So, of course, I'm not playing down any of the stuff he did. He did do stuff, but it was of a much less damaging in terms of the whole network, the 5 of them, than Cairncross or Burgess or arguably Maclean as well.
So Weisband then, how damaging was he?
Well, William Weisband was an army codebreaker during the Second World War, and his parents had come to America from the Soviet Union when he was about 15. And he was one of these guys who, I was talking earlier about people patriotic who think that they're doing something for their country against the country they're actually living in. And they see this other country as their country. And he saw the Soviet Union as his country. And so he was working for the KGB. They recruited him. They had him working in the army code-breaking unit, and he wandered around quite a lot. And at the end of before the war, in fact, what became Bletchley Park, the code-breakers, the British code-breakers, and John Tiltman in particular, who was the leading code-breaker throughout the war and arguably into the Cold War, he had done a deal with the Estonians, who had been, obviously Estonia had been a free country before the war, and they had been monitoring Soviet communications. He'd got a lot of stuff from them. He'd had a unit, not at Bletchley itself, at Wooden Hall, which was working on Soviet ciphers, because obviously the Soviet Union, once it became our ally, there would have been people at Bletchley Park who would have been pretty angry but were spying on our ally. And the Poles who'd come to Britain, the Polish code breakers who came to Britain, were also kept secretly north of London, Stanmore, working on Soviet codes and ciphers. And at the end of the war, MI6 had a major operation rescuing Finnish code breakers and who had broken the Soviet ciphers and bringing them to Paris, in fact. So all of this stuff was there for the British code breakers to work on and work around. And Around the back end of 1944, Bletchley Park set up a separate unit in London with top code breakers working on Russian codes and ciphers. So by the end of the war, beginning of the Cold War, they had an enormous amount of stuff on Soviet ciphers. And indeed, the German teams working in Bavaria on Soviet ciphers, their material was taken up by a team sent out there from Bletchley called a TICOM team, Target Intelligence Committee, was assigning all these different jobs, and they went to an intercept and analysis site. The Germans had done an enormous amount of work breaking Russian ciphers. So, as well. So by 1947, the British and the Americans had broken most of the top Soviet ciphers. There was only one they couldn't break. And William Weisband is in there able to see all this because, he's wandering around chatting to people, finding out stuff as much as he can, obviously in his role, pretending it's in his role as a code breaker, but actually in his role as a KGB agent. And 1948, Black Friday it was called, every Soviet system went off the air. And when they started coming back again, every single one of them was using new systems and a new cipher, apart from the ones that had been using the one cipher the British and Americans couldn't break. And it wasn't until the 70s, late 70s, they begin to get back to anything like what they were able to do in 1947-48. And I would argue that given how important signals intelligence is, given how much you get, how accurate it is because you're getting it from the horse's mouth, that did far more damage than Cambridge Spies did and ever could have done.
Extraordinary. Michael, I was thinking, whilst, you've been writing about intelligence matters for many, many years, have you ever actually met a traitor yourself?
Yeah, I have. Yeah, a guy called Michael Smith, actually, by coincidence, who I'd written about when I was...
You heard it here first.
Yeah, who I'd written about when I was on the Telegraph. Yeah, but he'd given away BA Systems secrets. Yeah.
Was there anything about him that, what was your sort of experience of talking to him?
He'd been released. He was just an ordinary bloke, really. I don't think there was anything special about him.
Yeah.
Sadly, I never met Kim Philby. I would have liked to have met Kim Philby. I think everyone in journalism would have liked to have met Kim Philby. Philip Knightley, who was a friend of mine who sadly passed away some years ago, who was one of the first people writing on intelligence. In fact, his book, The Second Oldest Profession, was one of the best early books on intelligence. He was on the Sunday Times team that worked on the Cambridge Spies story.
His stuff is brilliant, actually. And Nigel West, I think, has written about meeting Anthony Blunt and describing that as a particularly unpleasant experience.
Yeah, I mean, I've never met Blunt. I always assumed that he would be one of these people, upper-class people with a very, posh attitude towards those who weren't posh, I guess. But I shouldn't make that assumption because I never met him.
There are other traitors, such as George Blake, who do a huge amount of damage, particularly in Berlin and with MI6's networks in Berlin. And this is actually a horrific story when one looks at the actual human cost of his betrayal.
Yeah, the US and MI6 networks across East Germany were rolled up as a direct result of Blake's treachery. But paradoxically, the tunnel is going on at the same time, and Blake doesn't know anything about it. It's where it's operating. He had been actually involved in London before he went to Berlin. There was a very much to know basis on what was actually happening in Berlin. So the committee that he was on looked at the possibility and feasibility of it doing it, but didn't actually provide any detail that would have helped the Russians. And by the time it started up, he was in Berlin and kept completely out of it. They were completely out of the loop. There was only one person, the MI6 head of station in Berlin, who I think was the only person in Berlin, MI6 officer in Berlin, who knew about it. That was Peter Lund of the Lund Poly family, which subsequently became tourist company, Lund Poly. Subsequently became Thompson, and there's now, I don't know, some huge pan-European company, isn't it?
Yeah, I remember Lund Poly.
Yeah.
Well, okay, so we have covered a lot of traitors from the 40s, 50s, 60s, but I mean, we still see it today. And now this is perhaps controversial. There may be many viewing who don't believe what Edward Snowden has done as traitorous, yet he is currently languishing in Moscow, much like his some of the Cambridge spies who drank themselves to death there. Edward Snowden, do you think I'm fair in including him in a podcast about traitors?
Well, I guess he would argue that he wasn't a traitor as well. But in terms of damage done, it was immense. And GCHQ are still having to work around stuff that, and of course, he was working for the NSA. And controversially, he was working as a contractor. He wasn't an NSA officer himself. So he's not instilled with the ethos that NSA and GCHQ officers are instilled with and understand of the need to know stuff. And he was able to work to hack his way, basically, as a computer expert across the NSA networks and grab loads and loads and loads of stuff. Some of it was largely inconsequential. Some of it was hugely damaging for no good reason, because actually there was nothing wrong doing what it was doing. Some of it was doing stuff that was arguably very wrong or difficult morally, very difficult morally. I mean, I remember one memo, GCHQ memo, telling staff that they would be monitoring sex sites, basically, because Islamist terrorists were using these to communicate with each other. And so they were warned that they might see stuff that they wouldn't want to see. And if they did and felt they were unhappy with it, they should tell their supervisor and they would be taken off that work. And that felt very morally damaging to people. I think understandably so. It did to me. I just felt that's really not great. But equally, if it stops terrorists bombing somewhere, then it's the job. But it was the idea that every email, every computer can be hacked into, and the idea that somehow GCHQ and NSA were doing that Snowden put across, and the reporting of Snowden put across, was just simply not true. The idea that it could access Facebook or various browsers or whatever, again, simply not true. Everything was monitored by computers which searched for key phrases, keywords, key indicators, and only stuff that threw up those actually ended up in the basket to be looked at. So it's a computer going through all these stuff. It's not people reading your emails or stuff like that. The links to computer companies that were running servers and social media sites were only links. The two key programs were Prism and Tempora. Prism, an NSA operation, Tempora, GCHQ, neither of which are carrying out mass interception, and both of which required warrants to go after the information required. Snowden made it sound like NSA and GCHQ had back doors provided by Google, Microsoft, Yahoo, Facebook, Apple into their systems. And that is simply not the case. What Prism is Dropbox-style electronic facility where if NSA have a warrant to get information, then those companies can put that information into that Dropbox. It's secure, And of course, it's confidential as well. And that's it. It's not, backdoor links to Google or Microsoft. Tempora is much more technologically clever, I suppose, sophisticated. It's the monitoring of emails from across the world as they come ashore in the UK on the transatlantic underwater cables. Sounds odd, I suppose, that the internet is actually part of the internet is running under
it's fiber optic,
running under the sea via fiber optic cables rather than somewhere up in the air. And that is the computers are programmed to actually get rid of any emails, any communications that don't have keywords or indicators in them that would indicate terrorism or espionage or whatever, depending what they're looking for, and to take it down, really, really down. It's not millions of emails. It's just down to a few thousand in the end, which include these indicators and keywords, and those will be looked through. And yes, if your email happened to include a key indicator, maybe your innocent email might be read, but nothing will be done with it.
Yeah, so I think you've laid to rest any fears of any viewers or listeners there, Michael. Thank you. So, Michael, look, this has been great. I could natter away to you all day about the contents of, that's the great thing about Here It Is. So many different elements within this book, successful operations and the cooperation between the intelligence services. But I have to confess, it's the failures of human intelligence and traitors that interests me most, actually.
Yeah.
But brilliant. Thanks, Michael.
That's because they're people. We're all interested in people. They're human beings.
Indeed.
Yeah. Okay, Ollie, thanks. Lovely.
Thank you.
Lovely to speak to you.
Thanks so much for listening. Plenty more great episodes to come, so please do share with friends and family. But until then, thank you and good night.